colloquy between the three of us about the influence of Nazis in the modern world and the great achievement that has taken place in Chile, where Colonia Dignidad has basically been blown open, and a very sinister former Nazi who ran it is now on trial for child molestation, and thank heavens that this has happened, something good. But it's not all good by any means, and we're going to be exploring this because Sinister Forces Book 3 is in, and the beauty of it is that you don't need to have read books 1 and 2 to understand it. In Book 3, Peter Levenda very kindly backgrounds you as he goes along, and it's an astonishing breakthrough achievement in understanding who really runs this world of ours and why. It's also, by the way, got what I think is probably the best researched exploration of my own early life that I have ever read. It is really, really well researched. And Peter and I are going to be doing Dreamland, probably a couple of Dreamlands after September the 1st, exploring Sinister Forces Book 3 in the whole Sinister Forces series in great detail. You can get all three books, as a matter of fact, from the unknowncountry.com store. And for subscribers this week, we have one extraordinary interview with Nick Redfern, who has been very quietly and very effectively researching close encounter witnesses under official surveillance. And he has got documentation that will shock you. The official world is watching us, so listen up. And if you're not a subscriber, take this opportunity to subscribe to unknowncountry.com. This is the dog days of summer, and they tell us we need subscribers. It is a little quiet over there right now, so if you want to take your opportunity to subscribe, do so now. Grays will be out in a few weeks. The first edition of my readings from the Grays is up now in the free section of Dreamland. It will not be posted as downloadable because of contractual restrictions with my publishers, but I'm reading chapters 1, 2, and 3 over the next 3 weeks. They're listed as Dreamland special events in the free Dreamland Windows Media Player on the left-hand side of the website, if you're not there now, left-hand side of the masthead. So there's an awful lot going on right now on unknowncountry.com and in our lives in general. The Grays is on the way. I would like to go ahead and welcome Jim and Peter Levenda are both waiting, and we have got a lot to talk about. A lot of changes have taken place involving continuing Nazi influence in our world. First, there are issues that have arisen involving former Nazis and their arrests in South America and what this may mean for the future of what I call, and I think Jim calls, we all call the Fourth Reich. That is to say, the post-World War II Nazi survival, which has played such a profoundly important part in our world. And when you're talking about power on planet Earth right now, you must include the concept of the Fourth Reich, or you're not talking about the real power. Welcome, Peter Levenda, author of Sinister Forces, Books 1 and 2, and Jim Marrs, author of Rule by Secrecy and so many other extraordinary books. Two of the great conspiracy theorists of our age, in fact, arguably the most important thinkers in this area in the world. Welcome to Dreamland.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, howdy, Whitley. It's always good to be with you.
Well, good. Jim, why don't we start by defining National Socialism as it was, and as it is today?
Right. Well, the term Nazi, and one of the interesting things about Nazis is that in today's politically correct environment, that seems to be the one group that it seems to be okay to ridicule and to hate and to hold up to derision. It's okay to hate Nazis. But most people don't understand what a Nazi is. A Nazi is an ideology. It's not somebody in a black uniform with a swastika armband. And the term Nazi is an acronym for National Socialism. Now, National Socialism is a form of socialism. And let's not forget that, because most people think that a Nazi and a communist are on opposite ends of the political spectrum, and they are opponents, but yet they both want a form of socialism, which involves centralized control. The communists wanted international communism. They wanted worldwide socialist program. And the Nazis' National Socialism is socialism that's confined to one country, which plays into the hands of the international banking community, since they can play one country off against another and have for hundreds of years. National Socialism, then, has also come to mean the combination of state and corporate power, which is the dictionary definition of fascism. When you combine the power of government with the power of the large companies or corporations, then you have fascism. In fact, fascism, the term, is generally credited to Mussolini, the Italian dictator, who himself said it's really not the right word. He said the right word is corporatism. This is where you have a blending of state and corporate power. And I'll just end up by saying that what has happened in the latter part of the 20th century, early part of the 21st century, is that unlike Nazi Germany and fascist Italy in the 1930s, where we saw the state gain control over the corporations, today the corporations have gained control over the state, but the end result is the same.
And the end result is just as dangerous to us as we are witnessing. Jim, and I'm going to ask you to weigh in on this too, Peter. We're in a situation and I'm talking now the large scale in our world, where we went through 70 years of fighting the communists. It was the West versus the communists. The Islam was really nowhere to be seen. It was a tiny little irritant off there on the side that you never really noticed at all. We could travel freely in Islamic countries, etc., and so forth. Then as soon as the Cold War ended, another enemy appeared, Islam. And now I read in the papers these polls recently that have been taken in Islamic countries versus Western countries, showing how they think that we're dangerous and we think that they're dangerous, etc., and fanning the flames of this rivalry. Now, it seems manufactured to me, gentlemen. And how do you react to that, Peter?
Well, I would tend to agree. A lot of this is manufactured. I mean, there's a tremendous power in promoting fear and paranoia. This is exactly what happened in Nazi Germany when we looked for scapegoats. Hitler decided very early on that he was going to use the Jews as the scapegoat because it was a lot of anti-Semitism endemic in the region. For us as Americans, it's kind of problematic because we're composed of so many different types of people. To adopt an anti-Semitic platform just wouldn't fly. To adopt any other kind of platform wouldn't fly. Everyone has a spokesperson or a political action committee in the United States. So to stoke the fear and paranoia, to keep it going after the end of the Cold War, we needed a new enemy, and we had an enemy that was tailor-made. We contributed to the rise of Saddam Hussein. We contributed to the rise of Osama bin Laden. I mean, these were all people we had financed. We had set them at odds with each other. We had set them at odds with the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. We put Iraq against Iran. I mean, these are things that we've been doing during the Cold War and since then. So we need, in a defense-based industry, the way the United States is, I believe that we need a constant enemy in order to keep our system going, and that's the sad truth. We don't have an alternative yet. We don't have political leaders who've given us an alternative. So we live in a climate of fear and paranoia, which is increasing daily.
Now, Jim, this of course gets us to 9/11, which was the catalyst. This is what generated the new Cold War It's a nice, warm little war. Let me put it that way.
Right. It's a lukewarm war.
Right. You wouldn't say that if you were in Baghdad, but
no,
here it qualifies because it's not an all-out hot war, and it's also not a cold war. You're right.
By the way, I just noticed today the headlines are saying that they have declared a state of emergency in Baghdad. This is just, to me, it's deja vu all over again. This is like Vietnam when they said, oh, we're right on top of it. They just about have a good democratic government. We just about have the place pacified. And then, of course, the Tet Offensive came along, and we all realized it was a big ball-faced lie.
Well, I remember very well during the Tet Offensive the announcement of the retrograde advances.
Yeah, right. We're advancing to the rear. And I'm just wondering how many more young Americans have to die before we finally, do what is ultimately going to have to be done, which is we're going to have to leave that country that we so precipitously attack based on faulty information and more specifically on lies, since we now have the Downing Street memo, which said that in the summer of 2002, the Bush administration was fixing the intelligence to their policy, which was to attack Iraq. It's just amazing, and as you said, everything that's happening today is predicated on the basis of 9/11. There was a recent survey done of our fighting forces in Iraq, and 85% said they felt they were there fighting in retaliation for the 9/11 attacks, even though President Bush himself has admitted that Saddam Hussein Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. But that is the perception that's been put out there, and this gets back to the manipulation that Peter was talking about. And as he correctly pointed out, we must never forget that arms, weapons, are the leading export of the United States of America. We are the largest arms dealer in the world, period. And to successfully sell arms, you have to have continuing conflict. And, Peter, let me ask you this. Don't you see at the very bottom of this military-industrial complex a nucleus of men and their offspring who came from Nazi Germany?
Certainly, of course. I mentioned that, of course, in Holy Alliance, and I pick it up again in Sinister Forces. I mean, the existence of a pro-Nazi clique in our country, going back to at least the turn of the last century until now, is documented. It's evident. We're dealing with. I don't know if Fourth Reich is really the right term. Maybe it's still the Third Reich. Just because they lost the war doesn't mean that the true believers of the Nazi era change their faith suddenly. That doesn't happen.
That's very true. That's very true. And in fact, would you agree that we beat the Germans in World War II, but we really didn't beat the Nazis? We just forced them to move.
Well, that's exactly correct. What we beat was the Wehrmacht. We beat the German army. That's it. As far as the Nazis were concerned, they stole a few marches on us, no pun intended. I mean, they managed to get their people into South America, into North America, into the Middle East, into Australia. I mean, they kept their nucleus intact, and they did that with huge infusions of cash, by the way, which then leads us back to Colonia Dignidad and all of that. Yeah,
cash, which still plays an important role in all of this. This has been driven in great part by two things. One, the desire on the part of the various intelligence agencies, and I include in that the United States Central Intelligence Agency and the various Russian intelligence agencies who were able to pick up Gestapo and SS people as well, their desire to use these people to their own ends and money, lots and lots of it. Coming from where would you say, just offhand, Jim?
Oh, well, it's real simple. They looted all of Europe. They are, here we are almost 60 years after the war, and they're still slowly recovering precious artwork and, money, gold, bullion, tons of gold went missing. I mean, they had the whole loot of Europe. And if you've read my book, Sisterhood of the Rose, I even put forth the thesis that in March of 1944, Otto Skorzeny, acting on behalf of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, traveled to the Languedoc region of southern France and may indeed have recovered the fabulous Solomon's treasure, which gave them not only more wealth of gold, silver, and precious stones, but also knowledge of ancient technology.
It sounds like we better talk about that a little further in just a moment. We'll be right back, folks. Okay, that was a great bombshell, Jim. Thank you for that. The Languedoc, recovery of Solomon's treasure in the Languedoc region. Very interesting that you say that, because I had a long conversation once with a member of the Habsburg family who told me that the family owned first of all, their entire armory is still intact going back to the 14th century, and it must be worth probably $1 billion at least. I'm just guessing, could even be more. But he told me that they had recovered treasure after World War II, that
Right.
had come from southern France. I wonder if he was talking about the same thing.
Very well may have. And the information I have is that Morton Bormann, who of course was chief of staff to Hitler and basically took over the running of the Nazis at the end of the war, his wife was arrested in Austria at the end of the war, and she had several thousand ancient Roman coins on her. Now, where did that come from? Again, more evidence that they may indeed have gotten Solomon's treasure, which, when you add with the rest of the loot of Europe, gave them such a powerful financial base that they were able to push forward their program of flight capital out of Germany and recreating, according to Paul Manning, a former New York Times reporter, they created 750 corporations all around the world, usually using some local as a front man, and it was from this incredible business, industry, financial basis that they have reconstructed their Reich, using the United States of America as their focal point.
Now, Peter recently, first, folks, let me tell you that Peter wrote an extraordinary book called Unholy Alliance about many things, but among the things it's about is a journey he took to the then notorious and extremely dangerous Colonia Dignidad, a colony in Chile that had been created by Nazis and former Nazis after World War II. And Peter has talked about that on this program before. Peter, just give us briefly a picture of the Colonia Dignidad that you saw then, and then we'll get into what's happened since.
Well, the colony came to my attention because of a relatively brief mention in a book by Ladislas Virago called Aftermath, and it intrigued me. He claimed that there was a kind of Nazi safe house. It was a secret estate. You couldn't penetrate it. It was used to hide Nazis on the run, war criminals, but it was also a religious encampment of some kind involved with occult or mystical practices. So that combination was irresistible to me. I was doing research for Sinister Forces at the time, and I decided to go down to Chile and to see it for myself. That was in 1979. And when I got there, what I saw was a state within a state. And that's how the local police and the local military described it. They were in awe of the place, but they also disliked it very much because it was populated entirely by Germans. They only spoke German on the estate, or English, oddly enough, but never Spanish. They had a few front people who dealt with the local population, but this was a heavily armed operation. We didn't know very much about it. I knew very little about it when I went down in 1979. It was only about a month later when I got back that I discovered that Amnesty International and the CIA had files on the place. They knew what was going on there, and as it transpired, it turned out it was a torture and interrogation center that was used
at times by the CIA.
Well, this is what I think is coming out now, which is why you will not see news of Colonia Dignidad in the United States. If you do a search through American newspapers and American media for anything concerning Colonia Dignidad, you're going to hit a vacuum. There's nothing there. It's a black hole. The only news we're getting out now about the colony is either from the BBC or it's from the Latin American newspapers. Now, I'm in South Florida. You would think that in a huge Latin community like this, there would be a lot of focus, a lot of interest on something like the colony, but there's nothing. Not in the Miami papers, not in the Latin papers. So Condoleezza Rice was just down there relatively recently. She was making nice with the new president of Chile, who's a socialist, by the way. Colin Powell has made a few remarks about mistakes we made in Chile. that we should not revisit. Everybody seems to be covering themselves when it comes to the new revelations coming out about the colony, because they were finally raided. It was run by former Nazis, as it turned out. There was torture taking place. There was the sexual abuse of children, for which the leader of the cult has just been convicted on, I think, 25 counts of sex abuse. They haven't even gone into the human rights abuses yet. And
well,
they discovered...
They've kind of thrown the guilt all back on this fellow Strasser, right?
Schaefer, yeah, Paul Schaefer. Yeah, he was the guy who.
He's only a figurehead. This is an ongoing process that lasted 60 years, and
obviously, yeah. I mean, this was part of Operation Condor. As they discovered, there were 2 airstrips on the place, and they discovered later during the court proceedings that these airstrips were used to fly arms. I mean, for some reason, Colonia Dignidad was a pit stop, or maybe a central location in an operation in which people were targeted for assassination all over the world, including in Washington, D.C.
Right. Peter, my question to you is, do you feel like the this colony, was that the center of maybe post-war Nazi command, or was that maybe just one of several?
I think it was probably only one of several. I think that there might be others. Chile was the optimum place for this, though, to be quite honest, because they had a large German population, very pro-Nazi during the war. Chile didn't declare war on Germany, I think, until the last days of the war. So you had there's a book that came out some years ago. It's only in Spanish, unfortunately, but it contains huge lists of the numbers of Chileans who were members of the Nazi Party during the war. So we have a huge infrastructure ready to accept this. So I think where Colonia Dignidad may not have been the only center, I think it was certainly one of the most important ones, because they were protected by the government. The Chilean government had, protected this place since the beginning. And their involvement in the overthrow of Salvador Allende is documented. They were involved in that. They were involved in torturing political prisoners after the junta, after the military coup, all through the 70s at least, as far as we know, as far as the court testimony goes this far. So we know that it was part of Operation Condor. We know that they were assassinating political opponents everywhere, including Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. in the 70s. And the man who was responsible for that, an American, as it turns out, a pro-Nazi American, Michael Townley, has been interrogated last year. He's in witness protection in the United States. But they were talking to him last year about biological and chemical warfare experiments that had taken place at the colony that he was involved with, along with the Chilean secret police. And we're talking weapons of mass destruction again in the hands of Nazis. What kind of Robert Ludlum novel is this?
Exactly. When you brought up, and that brings up another fascinating aspect, I think most people listening to this program realize that we brought the Nazi rocket scientists and technical people over here to the United States to help us in the ensuing Cold War against the Soviets. But a lot of people don't realize we also brought their psychiatrists and their mind control experts over here, and they've been working.
Some of us were victimized by those people, I might add, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, that was it. They came over here and they continued their work, and that should be worrisome to people who would like to think they live in a free and democratic country, that we have Nazi mind control experts in positions of authority over the CIA mind control experiments and the things that are going on today that may be impacting us through the media, through the HARP project, and through who knows what means.
Which gets me back to the strange and frightening silence that Peter referred to on the part of the press in the United States about Colonia Dignidad and its setbacks, and in fact really any setbacks or anything that involves the revelations of ongoing Nazi terror in this world. Peter, where does this come from? Is this overt? Is there a gun to the head of the press, or is it more subtle than that?
Well, I wish I knew, because here I am. I'm in South Florida, and I've been on radio on one of the Latin stations talking about it in Spanish, and this is news to everybody. They've never heard of anything like this. And then I never got asked back. I mean, it's one of these things where I think in South Florida, where you have a large anti-Castro Cuban population, they really don't want news of Colonia Dignidad to spread around because it's going to point to something else. There was a lot more going on with the colony than simply they were torturing local Chilean political prisoners. I think you're going to find complicity of our government in some of those documents they've uncovered. I think you're going to find some witnesses who will attest to American presence at the colony. We know Michael Townley, an American citizen who's now in the United States, was deeply involved with the colony and deeply involved with the Chilean secret police. So you have a potential tinderbox there that's going to ignite one day. And I think this administration, I think every American administration would want to distance itself completely from any revelations coming out, and they're going to try to keep Colonia Dignidad a kind of sideshow, something that just happened in one of those weird South American countries that we don't want to think about. But
of course,
at the same time,
which suggests it might be much, much larger, and we're going to keep on with this when we get back, folks. In the early 30s, Adolf Hitler secretly set the German parliament, the Reichstag, on fire and blamed the communists, creating an atmosphere of terror in Germany, and the German people willingly gave up their rights, their freedoms, everything, in order that the government could have a free hand in stemming this terror. Sound familiar? Well, when we get back, we're going to be getting up to date on just exactly where we are with the 9/11 investigation and its relationship to Nazi practices, Nazi techniques, and Nazi power. We'll be right back. When we left the air, we were getting ready to talk about 9/11, and it's something that I had wondered whether or not we should even address in this, but it's inevitable that we must, because the relationship or the similarities between the Reichstag fire and its aftermath in Nazi Germany and 9/11 and its aftermath in the United States cannot be ignored. They're terrifying, quite frankly.
Exactly. That's exactly true, Whitley. When you look at the Reichstag fire, which to that kinder, gentler age was just as much a shock to the German nation as the Twin Towers destruction was to us, followed by the hurried passage of emergency legislation, the Enabling Act in Germany and the Patriot Act in the United States, and then the consolidation of all the police forces, which of course has now occurred here under Homeland Security, and the creation of detention centers for dissidents and terrorists, which has also occurred here. The parallels are just uncanny.
Absolutely. Peter, how do you react to it? Before you do that, I'm going to sort of lay some groundwork. I have written about this on my website a number of times in my journal, which I guess is now called a blog, but it's been going for so long it was pre-blog. Anyway, and in this I said that I felt I kind of came to a bottom line, that I did not know whether or not there had been culpable participation in this on the part of the administration, but the public record reflects the following. The Federal Aviation Administration warned the National Security Agency, of which Condoleezza Rice was then the head, 11 times, count them, 11 times, that there was a danger that planes may be flown by terrorists into the World Trade Center prior to this happening. That fact was classified until after the election, and during the 9/11 hearings, Condoleezza Rice testified that she was blindsided. This testimony was never challenged by anyone from either party. In my opinion, therefore, they knew for certain in advance and at the very least did nothing, because the infrastructure was already in place for the FAA to warn the airlines. It was not done. Had it been done, One of the things that has not ever been discussed, if you notice, if you read the logs of these flights, you will find that they were mysteriously flying with far fewer passengers than they usually did. These were flights that flew 80, 90% full. Suddenly they only had 40% capacity filled on those days. The reason being that the terrorists had made a lot of fake reservations, and these people were no-shows. Now, that alone, an excessive number of no-shows under the security procedures that were in place at that time, would have held those flights on the ground had the FAA instituted the proper warnings to the airlines. It did not, because the National Security Agency did not let it. Reactions.
Let me add to that, Whitley. There's also the question of the war game exercises. There were several war game exercises that took place on the morning of September the 11th, 2001. Some of them to include false radar blips on FAA radar. And, of course, this also explains why our normal defense system and our interceptors were all out of place, out of position. And what we now know is that there was a meeting of Mohammed Atta and some of the leaders of the named hijackers in August in Spain. And we do know that the plans for this attack were discussed. And when they asked Mohammed Atta, the supposed leader, well, when is this going to happen? He said, well, I don't know. I'll have to get back to you. Well, wait a minute. The leader of the hijackers doesn't even know when they're going to launch the attack. And that leads us to the National Security Agency, which it has been well documented, intercepted a message from Atta the day before 9/11, and he said, the match is about to begin. Tomorrow is 0 hour. So he finally had his time. And it was time to coincide with these war game exercises, which completely disorientated our normal defense system. In fact, Richard Clark, who was head of the Counterterrorism Task Force, said when he contacted General Myers of NORAD and said, have you got any interceptors in the air? General Myers promptly replied, well, you know, we're in the middle of a war game. The FAA, when they notified NORAD, some of the NORAD operators were saying, well, is this real life or is this the war game? The question becomes, how did Atta and these hijackers know when to coordinate their attack with these war game exercises? And, of course, the only explanation is they had inside information. This is what, to me, proves that 9/11 was an inside job.
I want to take a long route here. I want to go around a corner, and I'm going to come back again, folks. Let's go all the way back to TWA Flight 800. I will mention this in passing. TWA Flight 800 was apparently shot down by a missile. The government made strenuous efforts to disprove that, but the videotape doesn't lie, no matter how cleverly the CIA did lie about that videotape. The fact remains, on the ground, admitted by everybody, that of all of the vessels that were in the water at the time that flight exploded, one boat which went out to sea from immediately under the plane, the one boat that was in place to fire something at that plane, was never investigated by the FBI. Okay, that's one fact. Two.
Are you talking about the missile carrier Normandy?
No, I'm talking about a small speedboat.
The small speedboat.
Never investigated.
Right.
Never investigated at all. We don't know how big it was even. We just know it was there. And it moved out to sea rapidly, 30 knots. That's pretty fast. Now, that said, Bill Clinton has made the statement that there is another government over which he had, as president, no control. Okay. Pierre Salinger was waiting for something when Flight 800 exploded. He immediately, therefore, went on record saying that it had been blown up. He was then thoroughly debunked But what was he waiting for? We don't know. Now, let's go forward to the present administration, to 9/11. That day, and that day only, maybe a day after, there were reports, news reports, to the effect that Air Force One had received fallacious information about the route it should take back to Washington after it took off. And they realized on board the plane that something was wrong with what they were being told, and they diverted the plane all the way out to Nebraska, a decision made aboard the plane. In passing, it has been mentioned that the plane's communications were not operational during this time, and everyone aboard was forced to use cell phones in order to contact the ground. Now, cell phone use at altitude is a very dicey affair. It usually does. It can work. I have to admit that after reading these reports to the effect that people in various of the planes who had cell phoned from altitude, and I was reading reports that couldn't be done, I've tried it. I have violated the rules. And it does work, actually. It worked from a plane over Kansas at 36,000 feet just 2 weeks ago. My cell phone had a good signal. Okay, that said, it's still dicey. But nevertheless, that was going on because someone within the government was affecting activities on 9/11 in favor of the terrorists. Someone somewhere above the government that's on the ground that we see. And that someone also, I think, was involved in Flight 800. Peter, how do you react to this?
Well, my reaction is that as we're talking about this and considering the theme of this program, maybe many of our listeners don't realize that there's a very strong solidarity between the Nazis, the neo-Nazis, and the old Nazis, and certain Islamic factions. There's always been an anti-Semitism that was common to both, and that was considered grounds for unity for a long time. And we had anti-Semitic imams and mullahs in the Middle East during World War II who were very pro-Nazi and who had, in some cases, SS officer rank. So when the Nazis did escape after World War II, they went to the Middle East. They were training secret police in Egypt, in Syria, in Lebanon, in various places. We know that there's a cooperation among these factions. And if you throw in to that very volatile mix the fact that many of our own political leaders of the last 100 years have been very openly pro-Nazi, anti-Semitic, pro-eugenics, and all the rest of it, you have the outlines of a kind of government within a government that has a completely different foreign policy and a completely different domestic policy than the leaders that we elect.
That's absolutely true. And let me name some names here. I think it's important to understand that prior to World War II, many of the very prominent people, such as Charles Lindbergh, such as Henry Ford, such as the Windsor family and the Royals in England, were very pro-Nazi. But then once the war began, most of them turned and became good patriotic citizens. I think Charles Lindbergh actually ended up flying a combat mission or two. But there was one fellow, a banker, who continued his Nazi affiliations, and that finally was prosecuted by the United States government in late 1942 under the Trading with the Enemies Act, stripped of his holdings in Union Banking Corporation, and that was Prescott Bush, the patriarch of the Bush family. And I think people need to understand that so they can see the consequences of people who continue their ideology through the years.
Well, this is important for us to realize, too, because this is another example of media blackout in this country where the Bush family origins are concerned. I mean, how often did we hear during Bush's first run, or even the first George Herbert Walker Bush, how often did we actually hear in the media about the origins of the Bush family and the Walker family and their support of eugenics conferences in New York City, of how they paid for Nazis to the United States to lecture on eugenics, how they supported financially the Nazis even after December 7th, 1941, even after we entered the war. They didn't stop with that type of support. I mean, you had a guy like Walter Schellenberger, the head of the of secret police within the German police system, a very important general who was an intelligence chief on the one hand, and he was running ITT on the other. And he didn't lose his position on the board during World War II.
He remained on ITT. Peter, we're going to have to take a brief break now. Folks, we'll be right back. This is Whitley Strieber, it's Dreamland. We're talking with Jim Marrs and Peter Levenda about the Nazi connection and its importance in our world today, largely because of the fact that certain things that have happened recently in our world look an awful lot like things that were done in Germany at the beginning of the Nazi era, and it's scary. And specifically, the aftermath of 9/11, whether you figure that 9/11 was indeed simply done by terrorists and there was no complicity at all on the part of the government, but nothing more than sort of ignoring something that they knew would eventually happen if they did ignore it, which is proved. I mean, that's proved. The record shows that happened. Now, even if you accept just that, the aftermath of 9/11 has been a fantastic and terrifying assault on privacy. I don't know if you gentlemen know this, but it has recently been announced that the National Security Agency is going to be fielding dirigibles, 11 of them, over North America, which will be able to monitor every single movement and all electronically generated conversations of all kinds in the United States and Canada for permanently, all the time. They will never be gone. There will be 11 of them. They will be above the altitude, such high altitude they will not be visible. They will be solar powered and therefore able to stay on station for years at a time, with crews being brought back and forth by aircraft. Now, I find that horrifying beyond words. And you include in that, with that, things like these chips that are being sewn into our clothing, the possibility of implants being put into our bodies, being put into our driver's licenses. We are under attack. Privacy is under assault, a high-tech assault that is absolutely bone-chilling. And this comes from a guy whose dad didn't believe in driver's licenses. Okay.
That's true. And by the way, just today in the New York Times, we learned that under a secret Bush administration program initiated just weeks after 9/11, counterterrorism officials have gained access to the financial records of a vast international database and examined banking transactions involving thousands of Americans and others in the United States. So, of course, this was all rolled into the Patriot Act, to where they have unlimited access without warrant, without going to court, to access your financial bank records, to spy on you, to listen to your telephone calls. And, of course, this is just a Nazi wet dream. This is exactly what they would love to have done. The Nazis in Germany during World War II had to deal with paper documents, which could be forged and could be phonied and could be altered. But today, everything's in the computer, and they're working very steadily to get everybody chipped and pinpointed to keep up with exactly where you are and what you're doing. Some months ago, I was in Roswell, New Mexico, a little small town in New Mexico, and I went in a convenience store to buy some drinks and paid cash, but they wanted my driver's license. And I said, why? And the young clerk said, well, because it's got a magnetic stripe on it, and we have to swipe it through the cash register computer. And sure enough, my Texas driver's license has a stripe on the back that contains God knows what. So they know exactly where you are, what you're doing, what's in your bank account, what you're spending your money on. it's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I'm looking at my California license. It's got the same thing.
Exactly, and before long, those magnetic stripes will be gone, and you'll simply have a little chip embedded in your driver's license that can probably hold, anybody that has one of those flash hard drive things about the size of a pencil that can hold everything in your hard drive knows that they can compact a tremendous amount of information. But Whitley, before I forget about it, I want to go back to something about one of the threads throughout our conversation here has been this blackout, this black hole by the media. And that really, of course, strikes home to me, coming from the media as I do. But let me explain to you that the media today is under the control of about 4 or 5 giant multinational corporations, okay? And when I say the media, I'm not just talking about the news media. I'm talking about movies. I'm talking about DVDs. I'm talking about CDs. I'm talking about music, magazines, billboards. Everything we see and hear is under the control of these handful of corporations. And Project Censored last fall did a survey and showed that of these 4 or 5 corporations, it devolves down to about 113 people that control everything we see and we hear. I would also point out that the largest publisher of books in the English language is Bertelsmann of Frankfurt, Germany. And Bertelsmann, during the war, published Nazi propaganda. So I think we should become very aware and very concerned about who it is that's determining our reality by what we see and hear in the mass media.
Well, I'd like to contribute to that just a little bit and say, what does this all portend? I mean, what is this all in aid of? And I think if you look at the National Socialist agenda, and if you look at the Soviet Communist agenda, you're going to see one major similarity, and that is the eradication of the individual in favor of the state. I mean, the security measures that are being taken in the United States now, the Privacy Act problems that we have, the Homeland Security, the Patriot Act, all of these things that are taking away our liberties are taking away our individual liberties. So what they are doing is they're trying to erase us as individuals. They're trying to homogenize the country to an extent where we're all thinking alike and marching in the same direction. And I think that there's very little that we as individuals can do to combat that if the corporations are in control of it, except to create alternative measures of communication, alternative measures of trying to maintain our own integrity as individuals. It's going to be very difficult, and it may devolve into spiritual practices, such as Whitley has written about. It may come down to trying to individuate ourselves on a different level, just for self-survival.
I think that's very true.
Please go ahead, Jim.
No, go ahead.
Okay, well, I want to bring this. I think, Jim, you made a very, very powerful point a few moments ago, and that is that there are basically 113 people involved in controlling what we see and hear and understand and don't understand. And the horrible, frightening silence about the destruction of Colonia Dignidad in the United States, and this it's terrifying to me, because this is something, it's an open sore on the CIA, and because of that, because this is the kind of thing that the public needs to know if we're going to do better at being human beings and being a country in the future. And yet this silence. Peter, given that only 113 people need to be controlled, how easy would it be to control them based on what you know about the way Nazism and these totalitarians work?
Well, it just requires a basic old boys network, a kind of mutual understanding of what's best for the corporation is what's best for the world. I mean, this kind of control, of course, when it gets down to the grassroots level, can they control every single thing that comes out of the presses or comes out of individual local TV stations? It's difficult to do, obviously. You need a lot of coordination. But when there are policies that are instituted at the very top, you more or less have squelched any possibility of inconvenient news being published. I mean, think of Colonia Dignidad. Think of what a great story it really is from a newsman's perspective. You've got everything. You know, you've got a cult, you've got Nazis, you've got secret police, torture, sex abuse. You've got the whole 9 yards there. You know, there's virtually nothing that's not covered in that story, and yet we don't hear about it. You know, well, so it's not a question of the story is boring. You know, it's a question that someone does not want us to hear it.
And that should be, and you're absolutely right, Peter, that should be the proof to any reasonable person that if the media was only concerned with the bottom line profit or with sensationalism, this should be a big story. And it would gain lots of readers, lots of viewers, and they would make even more money. So this shows you that there is something in play here more than just the desire for more profits. There is total tight control. And by the way, you're right. Trying to control every individual editor and newspaper and reporter is very difficult, but they control the distribution of the information. And you may have actually, you know, maybe say in Florida they actually publish an article about Colonia Dignidad, but it doesn't go anywhere. And this is the control of the media. And by the way, we have seen the same thing because we've talked at great length in this program about 9/11. And we've talked about some very specific items of interest and topics, and none of these have been told to the general public. They are available on the Internet. They're available in some alternative books and in magazines, but you have to go out and really search for this. It is not told to you in the matrix that is woven about us by the major mass media.
And in the case of my own publisher of Trine Day, who published Sinister Forces, I mean, they had to go to court. They were being sued by the Special Forces Administration because of a book that a lieutenant colonel had written on his experiences in Vietnam. And he happened to mention going across over into Cambodia and a couple of other things that the Special Forces thought shouldn't be in the press. So they went and took him to court. And they had nothing. They had nothing to fight him on, and yet they still managed to virtually bankrupt him with legal costs. I mean, that was the process they used.
Because in the United States, unlike in England, in the United States, you have to pay your own costs whether you win or lose. Trine Day won, but they lost, and that was the point, to bankrupt them.
Exactly. That was their intention. I mean, and that's what you do with an independent publisher who's publishing inconvenient truth.
Well, that's true. And they're up against the huge banks of lawyers that are employed by the government with our tax money. It's a really lopsided fight.
Well, it is, gentlemen, and we have also come to the end of this fairly not lopsided but fair and balanced program. And if you don't think it's fair and balanced, you better think again, folks, because we are in trouble. We are not under assault. There's a frontal major war against the individual in the United States. And remember this, you are your privacy. The invasion of your privacy is the invasion of your being. As Jim discussed, as Jim mentioned, the destruction of privacy is the destruction of the individual. They want to make us into wards, as it were, of the state, under state control, and whenever it crosses your mind that maybe something you might say would be of interest to the NSA's listening devices, they have won a little tiny battle in this great big war. They are against us. They want us to become robots. They do not want freedom. They do not want individual liberty, or this world and this country would not look like it does.
That's what they want, is control of the entire planet, control of the world, which of course was the dream of Adolf Hitler.
It starts inside the mind of the individual. You need to feel watched, then you can be controlled. Any last words, Peter?
Well, I think you pretty much summed it up.
And I do mean last words.
No, that you pretty much summed it up, Whitley. I couldn't have said it better than that.
Peter, Jim, two extraordinary men. Thank you for your time. I think we have all been greatly enlightened, And thank you so much for being with us. Next up on Dreamland, Linda Moulton Howe. And she's got some new information about a possible California earthquake that is going to set you shaking in your shoes. I'm speaking to you at the moment from the heart of earthquake country, and you're about to experience something you just can't get elsewhere. Emmy Award-winning science reporter Linda Moulton Howe reporting on the absolute leading edge of science discovery and the true mysteries of the unknown. Don't miss her website, earthfiles.com, the one science website that tells you the secrets and gives you the facts the others dare not. earthfiles.com. This week she's reporting on, that's right, earthquakes in California, a chilling new University of California study. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. Yeah, last month, the June 22nd issue of the science journal Nature published recent detailed research of the San Andreas and San Jacinto faults in Southern California. The data shows the San Andreas so stressed that its next quake release of energy could be a magnitude 8 on the Richter scale. The San Andreas fault is considered the main boundary between the Pacific and North American tectonic plates that are slowly moving past each other. Someday in the far distant future, those moving plates might even break off whole sections of the Pacific coast into the ocean. The tension between those moving plates is what makes California earthquake country. To put a magnitude 8 earthquake into perspective, 100 years ago on April 18, 1906, San Francisco was hit by an early morning earthquake between a magnitude 7.7 and 7.9. That quake ruptured the northernmost section of the San Andreas Fault for 296 miles. From San Juan Bautista to Cape Mendocino, that 1906 earthquake stunned geologists with its huge horizontal displacement in the Earth's crust. At least 3,000 people died. Broken gas pipes set the city on fire. More recently, Professor Yuri Fialko of Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego, analyzed high-resolution images taken by European Space Agency satellites. He combined the visual imagery with data from historic geological records, global positioning system readings, and current seismic instruments stationed every 20 meters. The result is a study with a factor of 1,000 times improvement in spatial resolution over previous research. Professor Fialko found more evidence that the Southern California San Andreas Fault is mostly locked up, as he said. Not being able to move forward much, the fault builds up stress. Currently, the Southern San Andreas is moving only about 1 inch a year. According to Professor Fialko, that means during the last 300 years, the Southern California San Andreas Fault has accumulated so much locked-up energy that when it finally breaks that lock, the resulting earthquake will be huge, between magnitude 7 and probably closer to 8. This also means that the city of Los Angeles or the San Bernardino Riverside region could be hit by a seismic event as big as the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. When could the next big one happen in Southern California? The research indicates a 70% chance in the next 30 years. Professor Fialko was surprised to learn that the San Jacinto Fault, a little west of the San Andreas, is moving at about twice the speed as earlier estimates. So the San Jacinto Fault has built up a lot of energy, which could break out into a magnitude 7 earthquake. What if both the San Andreas and San Jacinto Fault erupted at the same time? Seismic engineers at USC SD Jacobs School of Engineering Structural Engineering Center have been testing buildings on what they call a shake table to see what various intensities of shaking can do. And these are big shake tables. On January 14, 2006, a 7-story building specially built and put on 25 by 40-foot shake table platform, was subjected to ground motions equivalent to the January 1994 Northridge earthquake. What the engineers are learning is that wood frame construction will collapse, but smaller concrete and reinforced steel frames will survive powerful earthquakes with only minor damage. The research from several years of work on the shake tables at UCSD have also caused most of Southern California's freeway bridges to be retrofitted to withstand severe ground shaking. The problem is that a magnitude 8 earthquake could seriously affect several square miles wherever it hits. Older homes and buildings built from wood frame construction could collapse in huge numbers. This week, I talked with Professor Debbie Kilb, a seismologist at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla. She worked with Professor Fialco on his San Andreas and San Jacinto fault investigations and begins with the question that Professor Fialco wanted to answer.
What Dr. Fialco was doing was he said, what's the probability that we're going to have a large earthquake, magnitude 6, 7, 8, on the southern part of the San Andreas fault? There's about a 70% likelihood of a large earthquake within the next 30 years. So if you look at the southern part of the San Andreas fault and say, well, how long is it? It's about 100 miles long. So how large can an earthquake be on a 100-mile-long fault segment? And the answer is about a magnitude 7 or a magnitude 8. For the San Jacinto fault, which is parallel to the San Andreas, just further to the west, it's not quite as long, and the largest one that we expect to occur on the San Jacinto fault is only a magnitude 7.
That's big.
It is definitely big.
Since you're talking about two fault lines, with both having a potential to release somewhere between a Richter 7 and 8 within the next 30 years, that's going to have serious consequences on the large populations that now live where both of those faults are.
That's right. So it's not necessarily within the next 30 years that we expected. We expect the earthquake could happen today, tomorrow, or maybe 100 years from now. And what would that mean for the nearby communities? One thing that we worry about is what direction is the earthquake rupturing? If the earthquake goes from the south to the north, all the energy is going to be directed to the north, in which case those folks in Los Angeles will feel the brunt of it much more than those folks to the south. On the other hand, if the earthquake ruptures from the north to the south, most of that energy is going to be going south, in which case people in Mexico would get more of a brunt of it than those to the north. So rupture directivity really plays a role in terms of who's going to get hit most, what's going to be the structural damages, and what kind of ground motions are we going to expect.
Have you all done any computer modeling that gives any indication of which might happen more than another?
There's been all kinds of modeling that's gone on, but you can think of it as dominoes. We don't know exactly what the small-scale fault structure is, and if you imagine lining up dominoes and somebody gets to take out 10 or 20 of them and add in another 30, what's going to happen when you hit the system is going to really change. But we can do an overall study and say, well, what are the general characteristics, what are the things that we absolutely know, and then incorporate the uncertainties.
And how does that come out in terms of what might probably happen?
And that's where they got the 70% likely within the next 30 years. Mm-hmm. Or what some of the Fialco study is showing, that an earthquake is probably likely to occur within the next 100 years. The rate of movement on the San Jacinto fault is twice as big as we expected. What this means is that we'll probably have twice as much energy released in the same period of time than was previously expected. Does that mean that we're going to have an earthquake today, tomorrow? No, not necessarily, just that the rate is twice as high. If you think of the plate tectonic boundary there, most people think that the San Andreas fault is accommodating most of the plate tectonic movement. But what the Fialco study is showing us is that some of that is being accommodated by the San Jacinto fault right next door. So the San Jacinto fault and the San Andreas fault are two major players in how the plate tectonic stresses are getting accommodated in that region.
And would you say that it's probably a good guess that the San Andreas fault will erupt first?
You know, your guess is as good as mine. These things have a repeat time of about 300 years, and we haven't been studying them for much longer than 600 or so. We don't really have the repeat time in the data to tell us that.
And the areas that would be affected the worst, given an 8 point on the San Andreas, would be what section of the San Andreas fault?
It would be right under where that earthquake occurred. So if we had an earthquake that occurred in, let's say, just to the east of the Salton Sea, the east of the Salton Sea there would feel the brunt of it. So So the closer you are to the earthquake rupture, typically that's where you're going to have the most damage.
What did the computer models indicate might be the most likely place to erupt?
Well, one thing they've modeled is they're looking at a rupture on the southern part of the San Andreas, and if it ruptures from the south to the north up towards L.A., the L.A. basin kind of rings like a bowl of jelly. And when you get that going on, you can think of waves sloshing back and forth, but these are waves and hard rock, and that's going to cause a lot of damage.
Would that concern also be the same with the San Jacinto Fault?
Yes, because the San Jacinto Fault will be just a little bit closer to it, a little further to the west there.
Mm-hmm. And it has the potential to release at 7 on the Richter scale.
Approximately, right. Now, we don't know if they're going to rupture all at once, one large earthquake, or in a series of smaller earthquakes, magnitudes 5s and 6s.
What is your own speculation about what might happen?
I always think be prepared, not scared. We don't have enough data to favor one over the other.
As a person studying seismology, what do you recommend to the public is the best thing to do if you're, say, in a house or an apartment or a structure?
The first thing you want to do is figure out where you are almost every day, all day. If you spend 8 hours at your desk, take a look around and see what might fall on you. If you have your bowling ball collection above you, you might want to move that to a lower level. If you have an insecure ceiling fan that's just hanging on by one wire, you might want to secure that. Just some simple 10 minutes to look around and say, what could fall on me and where can I move things is really going to help you. If you can bolt a bookcase down, you want to be buried by books.
And is it true that if you're in a building and it really begins to rock and roll, that you should run for a door frame and brace yourself in that frame?
You really need to know what the construction is like. Take a look at this construction. If that door frame is framed on either side by large windows that could crack and fall and generate a whole slew of broken glass, then you don't necessarily want to be there, especially if you're hanging out in your bare feet. So use common sense. Say, okay, wherever I go today, I'm going to take a look around and say, if there's a large earthquake that's going to occur now, where do I want to go? If I decide I want to go under this one desk, am I going to have to fight with 20 other people that want to get there?
Is there ever a reason to run out of a building instead of staying in it?
If you have time and you can get to some place where you are assured that nothing will fall on you, in the middle of a big grassy field away from anything else is a very nice spot to be.
Better than being inside of a building sometimes.
If you're in the middle of a field and nothing can fall on you, much better.
What do you personally worry about the most?
That I'll be out of town and the earthquake will happen.
Because you want to be there?
Oh, yeah, I want to be here.
And if you were there, what would be the first things you would do?
Well, safety first, of course, and then it would be check the seismic instruments. Where was it located? Did all our seismic instruments record it? Was there a precursory signal? Where were the aftershocks going to occur? Basically go into my scientific mode.
Another University of California San Diego professor has spent most of his career in the engineering department there, concentrating on how to strengthen freeway bridges throughout California so they can better hold up in big earthquakes. He is Frieder Seibler, Ph.D. Since 2002, Dr. Seibler has been Dean of the Jacobs School of Engineering and now serves as Chairman of the California Department of Transportation Seismic Advisory Committee. This week, I discussed with him Professor Yuri Fialko's research, which indicates that both the San Andreas Fault and the San Jacinto Fault are stressed to such an extent that there is a high probability over the next 30 to 100 years of at least one 7 to 8 magnitude earthquake in Southern California. In the event of a magnitude 8, I asked Dean Seibler how many square miles might be affected and how many people might die.
If you do have a magnitude 7 or 8 earthquake in the LA basin or in the Riverside San Bernardino area, this is an area where several square miles will be affected by strong shaking. And we have been going in California through a retrofit program of all of our state-owned bridges for the last 17 years now, since the 89 Loma Prieta earthquake. And we have essentially retrofitted all but maybe 5 or 6 of the state-owned bridges in California. And so I would expect, for example, for our transportation infrastructure in the Los Angeles region or in the San Bernardino Riverside region, that we will not see a lot of collapsed structure and a lot of loss of life, even in a magnitude 7 or 8 earthquake, but we will see damage to these structures. the building infrastructure side, we have buildings of older vintage which have not necessarily been retrofitted, okay? And so we still can expect significant damage and losses then in all types of buildings. It's not just one specific type. You have seen in the Northridge earthquake that we had significant damage in wood frame construction, which people did not expect before then, you know? Mm-hmm. And so since most of our residential construction here in California is wood frame construction, we would again expect in a bigger earthquake in LA or San Bernardino Riverside also significant damage in this type of construction, okay?
How many square miles of damage might there be?
It's very unlikely that it will be hundreds of square miles, okay? But depending on the length of fault that really ruptures, it can be in the tens of square miles.
Is there ever an argument for running outside as opposed to staying inside?
Certainly when you talk about residential areas, by all means, because typically our buildings are 1 to 2 stories, and if you get 20 feet, 30 feet away from your 1 or 2 story building, it can collapse and it won't hurt you, okay?
Right.
But when you talk about downtown Los Angeles, where you have all the high-rise buildings, I don't think it makes a big difference if you're inside or outside, okay? Mm-hmm. And the building comes down.
Right. What do you personally worry about the most as the worst case that could happen?
In a big earthquake like you're referring to, this is not over after the earthquake. The problems then really start because a lot of the economy will be interrupted. Just to get to the casualties in a first responder mode will be very difficult because even though a lot of our freeway bridges may stand up, but there will be other structures which have fallen across the freeway and you can still not use our freeway system, okay? Or that we have settlements behind our bridge abutments where you can still not use the freeway then even though the bridge is still standing. So it will be very difficult in the end to perform first immediate emergency response, the search and rescue, and then to provide the necessary emergency services for survivors of a big earthquake, okay? And we see that in other countries around the world, what problems that can cause, and I think it can be very similar here in one of our big urban environments if we get a magnitude earthquake of the size you're describing.
Is it fair to say that if an 8 magnitude earthquake happened tomorrow or this weekend, that the bridges that you've reinforced might hold up, but that gigantic sections of Los Angeles might collapse?
Well, we will have damage to our bridge infrastructure. We will have damage to our building infrastructure. So I think big areas of Los Angeles can and will be affected to the extent where it will be very difficult to have traffic in those areas and to move around, you know.
Right. Then you have the problem of how do you help people that need help? How do you get water and services? And that there could be a major disruption for as much as a week.
It can be a week, can be even longer than a week, okay? Depending on the extent of the damage, this can be several weeks.
And he added, maybe even a month or more. If Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside, and that area of the Southern California, San Andreas and San Jacinto faults are hit with a 7 to 8 magnitude earthquake. And as I talked with the seismologist and with this dean at the University of California, San Diego, who are wrestling with these issues of how do you reduce the amount of death and damage in large earthquakes that are inevitable in a state like California, I was thinking back to February 9th, 1971. I was a reporter at KNBC in Los Angeles, right out of Stanford University. And right after 6 o'clock in the morning, the phone rang. But where was I? I had been knocked out of bed, literally, and I had run for that door jamb that was made out of wood in an apartment down in Brentwood, and I was bracing myself inside of that door jamb while everything in the bedroom was falling onto the floor. And when the phone rang and jerked me into the reality of that I must function, and I crawled on my hands and knees to get the phone with things still falling around because the aftershocks continued. And on the other end of the line was the assignment desk, and they said, Linda, would you please go check out a rumor that there is a crack in the Van Norman Dam. That held 40 million and some gallons of water above the San Fernando Valley. And as I got into my then Volkswagen and I started up the San Diego 405 freeway, I was hitting cracks that were not there the day before. And as I got into the valley side, on the radio, I could hear that the reporters were in the air, in the helicopters from the stations, were reporting that the cement had given way. And I remember I pulled over to the side of the 405 freeway, and I sat there listening, stunned that I was now in a valley in which it could be flooded at any second or hour. And it was one of those moments, Whitley, in life where you have to make a decision. You're either going to go forward because it's your job, or you're going to turn back because it's logical to turn back. But I went forward, and I could not get back out of the valley for nearly 17 hours. I, like so many reporters, got trapped up where the military had moved in boats for evacuation in case that dam had given way. And it was a full moon, and the dogs ran and howled, and whole neighborhoods were completely flat where there were houses the day before. And after that, I had a whole new respect for that word, earthquake.
Wow, Linda, what a story. I have to tell you, that was really something to hear, especially because of the fact that we live in Los Angeles and also in Mexico, and we are often in Los Angeles, as indeed I am today. And I wonder whether or not we should just stay down in Mexico, but we're not there because there's another kind of earthquake going on in the area where we live, which is a political earthquake, and we're confronting these signs that on the streets that say tourists go home. So we went. we felt like we would obey those signs, and we're here now. And maybe goodness, it's just frightening. And folks,
well, I hope that you and all Dreamland listeners will do what that seismologist suggested. At least figure out what can fall on you and change that so it can't fall on you.
Well, you know, and everyone who's listening in the Southern California, in fact, in any earthquake zone around the world, you should do what Ann and I have done and get an earthquake kit in your home, which consists of food and water for at least a week, and the ability to sustain yourself with first aid kit and first aid instruction manual, etc., and so forth for a week's time, because it's very likely, especially in a place like the Los Angeles Basin, that you will not be able to leave for some time after a great earthquake, but that all of the services will be gone. Linda Moulton Howe, thank you very much for a sobering and helpful, useful report. Next week on Dreamland, Bob Hieronymus is going to be with us. Many of you are familiar with Dr. Hieronymus. It is going to be very exciting, talking about the power and the inner meaning of the Great Seal of the United States and where we come from. What were the Founding Fathers thinking when they created this great and powerful nation, and who's trying to unwind their work right now? Don't miss this, of course, gets us to 9/11, which was the catalyst. This is what generated the new Cold War between it's a nice, warm little war. Let me put it that way.
Right. It's a lukewarm war.
Right. You wouldn't say that if you were in Baghdad, but
no,
here it qualifies because it's not an all-out hot war, and it's also not a Cold War. You're right.
By the way, I just noticed today the headlines are saying that they have declared a state of emergency in Baghdad. This is just, to me, it's deja vu all over again. This is like Vietnam when they said, oh, we're right on top of it. They just about have a good democratic government. We just about have the place pacified. And then, of course, the Tet Offensive came along, and we all realized it was a big ball-faced lie.
Well, I remember very well during the Tet Offensive the announcement of the retrograde advances.
Yeah, right. We're advancing to the rear. And I'm just wondering how many more young Americans have to die before we finally, do what is ultimately going to have to be done, which is we're going to have to leave that country that we so precipitously attacked based on faulty information and more specifically on lies, since we now have the Downing Street memo, which said that in the summer of 2002, the Bush administration was fixing the intelligence to their policy, which was to attack Iraq. It's just amazing, and as you said, everything that's happening today is predicated on the basis of 9/11. There was a recent survey done of our fighting forces in Iraq, and 85% said they felt they were there fighting in retaliation for the 9/11 attacks, even though President Bush himself has admitted that Saddam Hussein Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. But that is the perception that's been put out there, and this gets back to the manipulation that Peter was talking about. And as he correctly pointed out, we must never forget that arms, weapons, are the leading export of the United States of America. We are the largest arms dealer.
Colloquy between the three of us about the influence of Nazis in the modern world and the great achievement that has taken place in Chile, where Colonia Dignidad has basically been blown open, and a very sinister former Nazi who ran it is now on trial for child molestation, and thank heavens that this has happened, something good. But it's not all good by any means, and we're going to be exploring this because Sinister Forces Book 3 is in, and the beauty of it is that you don't need to have read books 1 and 2 to understand it. In Book 3, Peter Levenda very kindly backgrounds you as he goes along, and it's an astonishing breakthrough achievement in understanding who really runs this world of ours and why. It's also, by the way, got what I think is probably the best researched exploration of my own early life that I have ever read. It is really, really well researched. And Peter and I are going to be doing Dreamland, probably a couple of Dreamlands after September the 1st, exploring Sinister Forces Book 3 in the whole Sinister Forces series in great detail. You can get all 3 books, as a matter of fact, from the unknowncountry.com store. And for subscribers this week, we have one extraordinary interview with Nick Redfern, who has been very quietly and very effectively researching close encounter witnesses under official surveillance. And he has got documentation that will shock you. The official world is watching us, so listen up. And if you're not a subscriber, take this opportunity to subscribe to unknowncountry.com. This is the dog days of summer, and they tell us we need subscribers. It is a little quiet over there right now, so if you want to take your opportunity to subscribe, do so now. Grays will be out in a few weeks. The first edition of my readings from the Grays is up now in the free section of Dreamland. It will not be posted as downloadable because of contractual restrictions with my publishers, but I'm reading chapters 1 West versus the Communists. Islam was really nowhere to be seen. It was a tiny little irritant off there on the side that you never really noticed at all. We could travel freely in Islamic countries, etc., and so forth. Then as soon as the Cold War ended, another enemy appeared, Islam. And now I read in the papers these polls recently that have been taken in Islamic countries versus Western countries showing how they think that we're dangerous and we think that they're dangerous, etc., and fanning the flames of this rivalry. Now, it seems manufactured to me, gentlemen, and how do you react to that, Peter?
Well, I would tend to agree. A lot of this is manufactured. I mean, there's a tremendous power in promoting fear and paranoia. This is exactly what happened in Nazi Germany when we looked for scapegoats. Hitler decided very early on that he was going to use the Jews as the scapegoat because it was a lot of anti-Semitism endemic in the region. For us as Americans, it's kind of problematic because we're composed of so many different types of people. To adopt an anti-Semitic platform just wouldn't fly. to adopt any other kind of platform wouldn't fly. Everyone has a spokesperson or a political action committee in the United States. So to stoke the fear and paranoia, to keep it going after the end of the Cold War, we needed a new enemy, and we had an enemy that was tailor-made. We contributed to the rise of Saddam Hussein. We contributed to the rise of Osama bin Laden. I mean, these were all people we had financed. We had set them at odds with each other. We had set them at odds with the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. We put Iraq against Iran. I mean, these are things that we've been doing during the Cold War and since then. So we need, in a defense-based industry, the way the United States is, I believe that we need a constant enemy in order to keep our system going, and that's the sad truth. We don't have an alternative yet. We don't have political leaders who've given us an alternative. So we live in a climate of fear and paranoia, which is increasing daily.
Now, Jim,
somebody in a black uniform with a swastika armband, and the term Nazi is an acronym for National Socialism. Now, National Socialism is a form of socialism. And let's not forget that, because most people think that a Nazi and a communist are on opposite ends of the political spectrum, and they are opponents, but yet they both want a form of socialism, which involves centralized control. The communists wanted international communism. They wanted worldwide socialist program. And the Nazis' National Socialism is socialism that's confined to one country, which plays into the hands of the international banking community, since they can play one country off against another and have for hundreds of years. National Socialism, then, has also come to mean the combination of state and corporate power, which is the dictionary definition of fascism. When you combine the power of government with the power of the large companies or corporations, then you have fascism. In fact, fascism, the term, is generally credited to Mussolini, the Italian dictator, who himself said it's really not the right word. He said the right word is corporatism. This is where you have a blending of state and corporate power. And I'll just end up by saying that what has happened in the latter part of the 20th century and early part of the 21st century is that unlike Nazi Germany and fascist Italy in the 1930s, where we saw the state gain control over the corporations, today the corporations have gained control over the state, but the end result is the same.
And the end result is just as dangerous to us as we are witnessing. Jim, and I'm going to ask you to weigh in on this too, Peter. We're in a situation and I'm talking now the large scale in our world, where we went through 70 years of fighting the communists. It was the 2 and 3 over the next 3 weeks. They're listed as Dreamland special events in the free Dreamland Windows Media Player on the left-hand side of the website. If you're not there now, left-hand side of the masthead. So there's an awful lot going on right now on unknowncountry.com and in our lives in general. The Grays is on the way. I would like to go ahead and welcome Jim and Peter Levenda are both waiting, and we have got a lot to talk about. A lot of changes have taken place involving continuing Nazi influence in our world. First, there are issues that have arisen involving former Nazis and their arrests in South America and what this may mean for the future of what I call, and I think Jim calls, we all call the Fourth Reich. That is to say, the post-World War II Nazi survival, which has played such a profoundly important part in our world. And when you're talking about power on planet Earth right now, you must include the concept of the Fourth Reich, or you're not talking about the real power. Welcome, Peter Levenda, author of Sinister Forces, Books 1 and 2, and Jim Marrs, author of Rule by Secrecy and so many other extraordinary books. Two of the great conspiracy theorists of our age. In fact, arguably the most important thinkers in this area in the world. Welcome to Dreamland.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Howdy, Whitley. It's always good to be with you.
Well, good. Jim, why don't we start by defining National Socialism as it was and as it is today?
Right. Well, the term Nazi, and one interesting thing about Nazis is that in today's politically correct environment, that seems to be the one group that it seems to be okay to ridicule and to hate and to hold up to derision. It's okay to hate Nazis. But most people don't understand what a Nazi is. A Nazi is an ideology. It's not